Well, thanks to my great good friend, Josette, and also kudos to AECOM. You've been a great strategic partner for us as we launched and continue to work on our 100 Resilient Cities project, and you've been with us around the world in many places, and we know together that we understand the resilience building challenge that still remains. As Josette said, it is so clear that cities are our future. Today in the developing world, 1 million people are moving to cities every 5 days. By 2015, there were at least 550 cities with a population of more than 1 million. And by 2060, which is a really opportune time to focus on in this Imagine series, over 3/4 of the global population will be urban. And many megacities, as you've heard, will have 20 million plus inhabitants. That was the estimated population of the entire world, at least the urban population of the entire world at the time of the French Revolution. So it's no exaggeration to say that the future of our cities will have a profound impact on the future of humanity. And while billions of people concentrated in dense urban centers pose mind-boggling challenges, global urbanization, as we know, offers unprecedented opportunities for future generations. And I'll go to that future in a moment. But first, let's go back a generation or two to two urban visionaries. Josette has already mentioned Jane Jacobs, and when she petitioned the Rockefeller Foundation for a grant in 1958, she wanted to write a book about the ineffable energies that animate city streets. She wanted to argue that to succeed, cities must feel lively, they must feel diverse and intense, but also casual and intimate, guided by what she called a most intricate and unique order, yet full of timeless wonders. She wrote that most vital cities, and how insightful she was then, have innate abilities for understanding and communicating, for constructing and inventing, with residents joined in what she called an intricate sidewalk ballet with their streets. Her vision, this vision, was formed in New York, where she saw the brilliant choreography of small-scale neighborhoods next to centers of high finance, where she saw immigrants rubbing shoulders with established innovator. And it made such an impression on her because she came to really focus on what makes great cities great. Around the same time, another urban visionary was conjuring a very different image of a city when America's greatest architect at the time, Frank Lloyd Wright, unveiled a proposal for the world's tallest building. It was to be built on the Chicago lakefront with a foundation sunk 150 feet into bedrock to support the building's astonishing 528 stories. This wasn't merely a skyscraper, it was a stratosphere scraper, twice as tall as the Burj Khalifa. It was his architectural embodiment of the idea of a more civilized urban future. Indeed, with this towering project, he thought he had solved many of the problems of the 20th century city. 2 years later, Wright was dead, and so was his dream. But new designers followed him, and they stressed steel, and they strung fiber optic cables, and they raised whole neighborhoods in the name of urban development and urban renewal. Today, technology is being integrated into the very skeleton of the urban fabric. Raya Bichardi argues that this will lead to an acceleration in innovation, which may not be technological, but be societal as well. Until recently, certainly until the last year or two, it seemed true that bigger, denser, more affluent cities were some of the more tolerant places in the world, welcoming immigrants and artists and thinkers. But remember Jane Jacobs. Followers of Jane Jacobs argued that technological feats and social anxiety can tear at the soul of a city, sowing the seeds of its own destruction. The dramatic tension between these two visions remains, and it challenges our 21st century conception of the city of the future. Getting this balance right may be one of the most important outcomes conceived during Imagine 2060, since almost half of the urban infrastructure that will define 2060 has not yet been built. And according to a World Economic Forum recent report, 65% of the jobs of the future do not yet exist. We must rightly marvel when cities are home to some of the most impressive engineering feats. From the man-made Palm Islands in Dubai to the Shanghai Tower in China, cities compete with one another now for taller skyscrapers, faster transportation systems, and cleaner energy sources. There is no doubt that technology is revolutionizing the future of infrastructure and disrupting the construction industry, certainly, in the process. Dubai recently announced the opening of the first ever 3D printed office, and Amsterdam may soon be home to the first ever 3D printed bridge. With greater convenience, innovative design capabilities, and reduced waste, 3D printing may dramatically bring down the cost of quality infrastructure. And certainly, given that funding has been a major bottleneck for enabling better infrastructure in many countries, including the U.S., this could be a liberating tool. Another major force that will transform the urban landscape is the emergence of the Internet of Things. In a project entirely crowdsourced by its citizens, Amsterdam is set to implement the Things Network, joining Taipei and Brasilia to become one of the emerging smart cities. The application of such smart cities is really revolutionary. Data-driven technology will be applied to every city in the world, in every possible domain. City officials will use it to plan for efficient energy usage, optimal transportation, minimal pollution levels, law enforcement, and much more. Tomorrow's cities will rely on millions of non-marked sensors, and citywide systems will use wireless signals to gather data from objects like trash cans and traffic lights and even entire buildings. Big data, machine learning, will transform urban decision-making. It will also transform how politicians interact with their citizens. With the rise of technology also comes increasing mobility. Many prototypes of self-driving cars are already being tested. Autonomous transport pods are running in Masdar City, Abu Dhabi. The engineer, Charles Bombardier, is conceiving of a future where once elevators can move horizontally as well as vertically, your autonomous vehicle could attach to your one-bedroom apartment 15 stories up and serve as an extra living or workspace. Why not? Saves parking as well. This could be critical for accommodating the extra million people who will be living in New York by 2060. Perhaps one of the most anticipated transportation projects originally conceived by Elon Musk and the architectural firm BIG is Hyperloop, an 800-mile-an-hour train. Its first prototype will travel between Dubai and Abu Dhabi, two cities in the UAE that are about 120 kilometers apart, in less than 12 minutes, with hope for another that would take people from San Francisco to Los Angeles in 30 minutes. The concept is to have cargo and passengers packed into separate pods and then sent through an inner-city system of vacuum tubes. So just imagine. And just last month, Musk tweeted that he was planning another type of vehicle that could make the trip between New York and Washington, D.C. in 29 minutes. According to Josh Geigel, president of engineering for Hyperloop One, we don't sell cars, boats, trains, or planes, he said. We're selling time. We're headed for a future, according to Burke Engels, founding partner of BIG, where our mental map of our cities is completely reconfigured as our habitual understanding of distance and proximity, of time and space, is warped and changed by this form of travel. The increased connectedness between cities is not only a matter of physical mobility, but digital awareness as well. Dennis Frenchman, a professor at the MIT Department of Urban Studies and Planning, has said, Digital technology has actually put a nervous system in the planet, so we can actually feel the pain in another country. This is a global level of consciousness and interdependence that we just never had before. And, of course, climate change. As climate change becomes a growing threat against our species, cities are faced with significant new and difficult decisions. In the future, many will be trying to integrate multiple solutions that involve sustainable infrastructure with new sources of fresh water, cleaner and better transportation, and renewable energy sources. Certainly in the realm of renewable energy, we've seen dramatic changes. The price of solar power alone is dropping to unprecedented lows. The cost of solar panels is expected to fall by 10% every year. In some countries already, wind energy is a cheaper source than coal. Many cities are embracing these trends and they're integrating them into their urban development. Copenhagen, the most eco-friendly city in the world, is set to be carbon neutral by 2025. Indeed, there's going to be an increasing focus on cities as the front line in the push for alternatives to fossil fuels. One very interesting approach, developed by a company called PaveGen, began as its founder was marveling at the kinetic energy generated by the heaving throng that passed through London's Victoria Station every hour. That light bulb moment led him to developing a floor tile capable of harvesting energy from people's footsteps, using electromagnetic generators in springy floor tiles to generate electricity. And that is being implemented already in many places that have high density around the world. In Abu Dhabi, Masdar City is the first zero carbon, zero emission, zero car city. One of its most notable features is a 45-meter-high wind tower that keeps desert temperatures as low as 20 degrees centigrade when it's 35 degrees or higher in other parts of the country. The greenification of cities is also being led by the emergence of vertical farms. These vertical farms aren't only aesthetically pleasing, they solve a crucial problem. As the global population continues to increase, more and more land will be required to feed them. Vertical farming could be a solution for cities to grow sustainably and not put so much pressure on the remaining land. It has advantages like increased crop production, obviously fresher food reaching the city sooner, and energy efficiency. Developers from many local governments around the world, including New York, Paris, and Bangalore, are exploring and piloting vertical farming projects. But technology will not be the only thing changing the city of 2060. So will demography. By 2047, there will be more people over the age of 60 than children under 15. And they are already choosing to live in cities at disproportionate rates. But the volume and the complexity and the velocity of urban life is expected to lead to significant psychological stress for this age group, even as their physical health leads to greater longevity. Indeed, for everyone, the flow of information, maybe overflow of information, will certainly challenge our privacy and autonomy, and we are living through the beginnings, clearly, of that moment. While there's certainly value for the big data from cities to improve the lives of its citizens, it will serve as an exploitable tool in ways we're just beginning to understand. Technology in our homes, the Internet of Things, robotics and artificial intelligence, for example, will increase our risks, and especially so in cities where density will increase vulnerability as devices are bundled, and it will simplify the ability to take down an entire network to stop mobility and commerce and lives. Invasions to our privacy by state and non-state actors may become terrifyingly commonplace, especially in cities. AI tools will reshape what work means and how wealth is created. According to Kai-Fu Lee, this will lead to even greater economic inequality. So be aware of these more dystopian but inexorable challenges to cities of the future as this conference unfolds today. And as we take into account the cities where almost all of the future population growth by 2060 will occur, remember that 95% of this final build-out of humanity will take place in urban areas of developing countries whose populations will double over the next century alone. London in 1910 was 7 times larger than it had been in 1800. But Dhaka, Kinshasa, and Lagos today are each approximately 40 times larger than they were just in 1950, and yet their economies contracted at the same time by 2 to 5% a year. Since 1970, slum growth everywhere in the global south has outpaced urbanization per se. Sao Paulo's favelas, a mere 1.2% of the population in 1973, was 19.8% in 1993, and it grew through the 90s at the explosive rate of 16.4% a year. The same trends are visible in Asia, but especially in South Asia. Karachi's sprawling Katachi Abadi, its squatter settlements, its population doubles every decade, and Indian slums continue to grow 250% faster than the overall population. Think of these numbers. And the African situation is even more extreme. An incredible 85% of Kenya's population growth between 1989 and 1999 was absorbed in the fetid, densely packed slums of Nairobi and Mombasa. By 2015, Sub-Saharan Africa had 330 million slum dwellers in cities, a number projected now to double every 15 years. So in this picture of the future, rather than being made of glass and steel, cities are being constructed out of newspaper, crude brick, straw, plastic, and scrap wood. Instead of cities of light soaring towards heaven, much of the 21st century urban world squats in squalor, surrounded by pollution, excrement, and decay. Thus, the future not only depends on seeking to transform cities into smart, sustainable, and technologically innovative urban areas, we must also seek to transform them into accelerators of resilience, equity, and inclusion. That means catalyzing the networks and the institutions needed to create cities that can sense and respond to novel social and economic challenges. It means amplifying civic and business and government support for integrating and lifting up poor communities. It requires everything from smart financing of affordable housing to new, more citizen-focused governance. 50 years ago, when people like Frank Lloyd Wright envisioned the future of cities, they imagined superphysical structures. Here in our young 21st century, we must also envision the future, as Jane Jacobs did, in super-social structures. In the latter type of urban space, the Jane Jacobs type of urban space, every inhabitant is an architect, empowered to reshape the contours of urbanization. There's a Kenyan slum, and just to confuse us, it's called Kosovo, whose residents for years had been ignored and mistreated. When the Nairobi City Water and Sewage Company found illegal water hookups in the slum, they simply cut off the water and electricity service. But they had never sent bills because no one in slums in Nairobi has an address. Streets weren't displayed on a map, so the government could literally act like they didn't count. Then the slum dwellers began to organize. They conducted their own census, and they forced government to count them for the first time. They demanded formal connections to the water supply, and then they organized street committees to ensure that everyone paid their fair share. And when the World Bank held talks with city leaders regarding a planned $100 million to upgrade human settlements in Nairobi, by that time, the slum dwellers had empowered themselves to become the architects of their own urban future, and they had a seat at the table. These slum dwellers are proving that even the world's most disenfranchised urban communities can join creatively together to upend entrenched systems, to hold leadership accountable, to bring stakeholders together, and facilitate and spread new ideas and new ways of thinking. Recently, much has been written about Canada's recipe for resisting the West's populist wave, ensuring that minority voters have a larger political voice, viewing immigration as a positive, and encouraging and celebrating multicultural identities. Mayor Bloomberg used to say that was the secret of New York as well, something we here must value and protect for 2060. Finally, let us think about water. Too much and too little, where you will focus your attention today. According to the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Assessment, this is the world's greatest future challenge. Since the Rockefeller Foundation launched a 100 Resilient Cities initiative in 2013, 1,100 cities in 47 countries have applied to learn techniques that make cities more resilient, including all the cities where Imagine 2060 events are occurring. And 80% of those cities cited water as one of their most significant vulnerabilities in their application. Indeed, cities are recognizing that in the 21st century, they must build and rebuild when hit to live with water, because the 20th century solution simply of paving and pumping and piping, those solutions are failing, and we see that all the time. Already, Mexico City is sinking with its rate of pumping water from below its surface, something that is true of many cities around the world. Land vulnerable to extreme flooding in many places now with this recognition is not being rebuilt for housing, but is being transformed into coastal buffer zones, parks, and other uses that will protect nearby surrounding communities from extreme weather. This is happening in the New York region. We'll discuss that today, I'm sure, and elsewhere around the world. Post-Sandy, Lower Manhattan will be building a 10-mile barrier to protect it from future flooding between 42nd Street on the east side and 34th on the west side. As you know, this area of New York houses major centers of our local and our national economic engine, indeed our global economic engine, including Wall Street and the World Trade Center. But it also includes vibrant neighborhoods and one of the fastest growing residential markets in the country. That's a lot of lives and a lot of assets worth protecting. When you think of a flood barrier, you might envision quite an eyesore. But resilience thinking in this project was a game changer. Working with experts from around the world, each community envisioned spaces built into the flood barrier that would enable them to reap their own social and economic dividends from how the flood barrier was designed. Increased green space and places to gather in one area, new bike paths to ease traffic congestion in another. Elsewhere, infrastructure that doubles as art, and markets to bring economic development to underserved areas. That's the resilience dividend, multiple wins from a single investment. Nearby in Hoboken, New Jersey, a Dutch-engineered underground parking garage will serve as a floodwater catchment facility with excellent new surface space for recreation. And roads are being built with new materials that absorb water more quickly and release it more slowly and safely after a flood. A new, exciting project conceived by Barbara Bratke in collaboration with Studio DE for Santa Monica, California, and perhaps you discussed this in Los Angeles, is a beautiful amphibious set of pavilions designed to be movable and quickly set up in areas of urgent need of fresh water. Called Foram, it is a self-sufficient, entirely modular floating structure with carbon zero emissions, equipped with water purification technologies and a solar pond for clean energy production, fostering coastal farming and acting as an artificial reef for clean water plants. Singapore solved for both too much and too little water in a single elegant solution. The Marina Barrage was designed not only to prevent flooding, but also to provide a freshwater catchment area for the city-nation that has been so dependent on Malaysia for its imported water. What's more, it added green and natural infrastructure that embraces water, creating a water park with breathtaking views and recreational opportunities. New housing and business investment followed. 3 wins for 1 investment. That's what we call the resilience dividend. All these projects have been energized and conceived to develop what I think the capacity of the city of 2060 will most sorely need, and that is resilience. And not just water will challenge our cities of the future. Because of the triple threats of globalization and urbanization and climate change, disruption is coming faster and faster and is staying longer. Not a week goes by that we don't see some kind of disturbance to the normal flow of things somewhere in the world. A cyber attack, a new strain of virus, a structural failure, a violent storm, a civil conflict, a terrorist attack, some economic blow. In the future, I would maintain that the cities that are preparing and planning for any crisis will rebound faster from every crisis. And they won't just rebound and bounce back more quickly. They will jump forward and transform. That's what resilience thinking enables. Resilience is defined as the capacity of an individual or a city, an organization or a natural system to better prepare for disruption, to recover more rapidly and more effectively from shocks and stresses, and to adapt and grow, transform from a disruptive experience. Resilience can be learned, it can be built, invested in, and practiced. Our work has discovered that there are 5 characteristics that resilient cities share in times of crisis and in times of calm. First, they are highly aware of their vulnerabilities and their strengths. They have both the willingness and the capacity to continuously assess their situation in real time, to take in new information and to adjust to changing circumstances by using monitoring mechanisms and feedback loops. Second, resilient cities are more diverse, and they have built in more redundancy in critical elements. They possess different sources of capacity and capabilities so that when one part of the system is challenged, the whole system isn't compromised. Being resilient has a social meaning as well. It means you can draw upon a more diverse range of ideas, of information sources, of technical elements or groups to keep things running. Third, resilient cities are well integrated. They have the wonderful, intentional capacity to coordinate functions and actions across all parts of the system, and they're able to bring together disparate elements to work collaboratively and develop and implement cohesive solutions. Information is shared and communication is transparent. A fourth characteristic of resilient cities is the ability to self-regulate, to bend rather than break in times of stress. It's the difference between failing safely and failing catastrophically, knowing when and how to decouple or island a part of the system that's in trouble to keep the problem from cascading. And finally, resilient cities are more adaptive. They adjust, they take new actions quickly in light of new information. They're nimble, flexible, and they can take on multiple functions or multiple roles when needed. These are the characteristics that cities will need to adapt and thrive in the changing, more complex world of the 21st century. Which brings me back to where I started with Jane Jacobs and Frank Lloyd Wright. Wright once said that he believed that we can achieve salvation by imagination. But Jacobs wryly reminded us that all that glitters is not gold. Both were correct. Together, we can redraft the blueprints and we can re-envision the future urban landscape. We are just beginning now to dig the foundation and raise the framing of the city of the future. For all our urban challenges, and I have really focused on some of them, there will be just massive opportunities, and there's no substitute for minds that think mile high. So whether it's Kenyan slum dwellers or Brooklyn designers, great cities are built by great people. That's why you are here today. So now together, let's imagine 2060. Thank you.
So, Judith Rodin, thank you so much. I know we're a couple of minutes behind schedule. Dr. Rodin did agree to take a couple of questions in a way. So if you have one, pop up your hand. I just have a quick one, but you kind of answered it maybe in your last remarks, Judith, which is as you go through, I mean, that's quite a tour of the globe and the globe cities you've given us. In part, when you get to the metrics and the demographics and those stories from Karachi or the slums of Nairobi, the favelas in Brazil, it's a very, very dispiriting tour. On the other hand, I don't even remember all the examples, but 3D printing and cars that we're going to live in on the 15th floor and walking on, I'm loving the footsteps as an energy source. So as you travel the world and given all your background and experience, do you, by and large, do you travel as an optimist or in the doom and gloom camp, or does it just depend where you are?
I really strongly believe that we are at an inflection point and that we could go over towards increasing unplanned urbanization and therefore increasing slum development, which will lead to poorer health and greater inequity and all of the things that we've seen certainly over the last 50 years. And so citizens need to take charge. They need to demand from their governments different kinds of planning. We've been really excited to work with so many mayors now on 47 continents, and we see them as such a great source of and partners for energy and innovation. We see the private sector, you heard in the introduction, private sector talking about social and economic resilience, not just built infrastructure. And so as these sectors merge and really have the capacity and will be the agents for the development of cities going forward, thinking holistically about infrastructure, social, economic, governance, not in silos, but in really integrated ways of thinking, I think is critical for the positive view to really emerge.
I'm reminded, actually, at that conference that I referenced with Sean in Jakarta last year, we had, I think, the Chief Resilience Officer from Bangkok, and in the course of just a half an hour with him, my head was spinning in terms of the doom and gloom and great hope and all that.
But Bangkok put cement over their canals.
Right.
In the name of urban development. They put transportation systems, new roads, and highways in what for hundreds of years had been a natural way for water after heavy rainfall to clear. That happened in Houston, too. Yep. So we have control over how we develop these cities. And I do think the one fundamental lesson, and I think everyone's taking it, is we have got to, in this century, learn how to live with water and not try to harness and capture and change it.
Or put cement all over it.
Right.
Any questions from the room? Yes, ma'am. We get a microphone here. If you could just say who you are and.
Hi, I'm Vivian from CBRE. My question is, a theme of the past few years is also refugee and displacement, in our world populations. And in your travels or research, have you seen any kind of vision or innovative, thinking around that?
No. The challenge of forced migration, both conflict migrants and climate migrants, is so significant, and I must say with great despair, that while I have seen pockets of activity, some wonderful settlements where they are training people and educating the young people and the like, they are really small pockets, and there's no global strategy for this. We have great reports from the UN. We have very significant thinkers who understand and have made real and important and scalable suggestions for this. But we haven't seen a lot of will in implementation, and I think it's one of the human tragedies that may force action, but I just worry about how.
Last question for Dr. Rodin from Josette here, and then we'll come to the panel.
Hi, Judith. One thing we didn't talk about is also your work on feeding the world and your rural passion. What I'm interested in, and it's kind of a groping question, is this tension between the rural population and the cities, and all cities have to eat. And is some thinking that if we make cities too attractive, it's just going to be a magnet and destroying the world's farming population. Have you seen, to echo this question, the past question, any innovative thinking on the interplay between our future cities and our rural cities to make this more of a dance that's complementary than a competition?
I have, and I would point us to the work that Akin Adesina and Ngozi Nkanjo-Iweala did in the prior government in Nigeria, the finance minister and the agriculture minister, because she was able, through financing and Akin through innovation in agriculture, to really begin thinking and implementing how that architecture might develop. So in cassava, which is one of their major crops, figuring out on-farm processing, even for the most smallholder farmer with 1 or 2 hectares, they worked on, and then they developed middle markets that weren't yet in the cities, but where processing occurred. They built transit routes to the cities based on where the crops were coming from and where the processing plants were, and they really built an intentional architecture. We're working with Dangote doing the same thing, tomatoes and tomato processing using the infrastructure that was built then. So I think you need to put, we talk in the U.S. about transit-oriented housing, but I think in the future it's not just housing. We need to think about transit-oriented economic development, thinking about agriculture, thinking about where and how our cities are developing, and then create corridors that really link the rural to the urban, again, in intentional ways that all along the route stimulate economic development. And as you know, Josette, we always kid that we need a sitcom or something, a soap about how cool it is to be a farmer, again, so that we can get young people who are willing and want to stay on the farm. The other thing that Akin did, which I think is right, and certainly as the head now of the African Development Bank, he's continuing that, is really talking about agriculture as an economic factor, that it's a growth factor for a city or a country. And when it starts to be seen as a business rather than as just sustainability, for people, it will transform, I think, its attractiveness for younger people as well. But we can't let foreign countries go into countries that still have land and buy it up. That is a really terrible thing that's going on.
Wow, that's worth a whole other conversation. We need to move on, but before we do, please, great thanks. We really appreciate it, Dr. Judith Rodin.